for our speaker today, Aiko Bethea, who's head of diversity and inclusion at the Fred Hutch. She'll be discussing how leaders build diverse teams. In her role at Fred Hutch, Aiko has developed and implemented the first enterprise-wide diversity and inclusion strategy. Her expertise in change management, building alliances, and collaboration is reflected in her ability to scale impact. Aiko is also principal and founder of Rare Coaching and Consulting, a bi-coastal consulting practice focused on coaching leaders and organizations to remove barriers to inclusion. She is deeply engaged in community building locally and nationally. She speaks nationally and locally on matters relating to leadership, diversity and inclusion, and organizational development. Aiko earned her BA from Smith College and her JD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Presenting Aiko.
All right, thank you. Wow, I turned around, then all of a sudden there's all these people. When I came in, it's pretty empty. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. I know that the topic is on how to build diverse teams, but my focus is more of a high level in terms of ways for you to think about diversity, equity, inclusion. What I've learned is that most people are not even aligned on what the language means. What does it mean in terms of diversity? What does it mean in terms of equity and inclusion? It's just these words that we throw out there. So I want to get us just kind of grounded into what it is, because you have to start there before you start jumping into the fire saying, hey, I'm going to have this diverse team. And you're talking about something totally different from your team and others, okay? Okay, so today I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Thank you, Uli, for the awesome intro, so I can make that part a little bit slower. Going to give you some facts about D&I and just in terms of our global as well as national space right now and why it's important. I don't like to spend a lot of time talking about why diverse teams are important because I feel like I'm trying to sell something that should be a given. I do ask people to rather instead think about why is it okay to have a homogeneous team? What are you missing out on when everybody looks just like you, has a similar background, and what could you possibly be missing out on when everyone is from a very similar background and looks the same and has the same experience how they show up in society? I think that's the question that should be pondered versus pushing a case for D&I, which really should be a given, especially for people who work in spaces like this and in innovation. That's something that you should be thinking about right away, like what's missing, right? Or how could this be better? And next, talk a little bit about impact. I do want to hear from you all because I think there's a difference in telling people things versus having them think it through themselves so that it's much more relevant to them and where they are. And next, just to begin, breaking down these words, what do they mean exactly? And a little bit about, well, where do you start in order to really dive into saying, hey, I want to be more engaged with diversity. I want to be somebody who's promoting diversity and inclusion. I want to have an equitable workspace. So thinking about what does that mean for you? I think the answer is really simple and really easy. So we won't even spend a huge amount of time on that, but it is something that requires you to self-reflect and be actionable. Okay? And then I'm hoping to have at least about 20 minutes for you all to ask questions. Just kind of give me a little bit of a hand raise if you feel like I'm speaking a little bit too quickly. Okay? Okay, so who's this lady? Who's this woman? I am part Japanese. My mom's Japanese. When I came here, I was raised in Spartanburg, South Carolina, very segregated community, very poor community, and my mother moved here when she was about 28. So in my household, we spoke all Japanese, but we were in a fully all black and very poor community in South Carolina. So I do think that my upbringing and my background has a lot to do with being first generation here, being low income, being in the South, being a brown person raised in the South, and being female. I think if any of you are not from this country, you know what, or you've lived in other countries, you know what it means in order to have to constantly translate systems and processes. If your child and your parent wasn't first generation, you know what it means in order to have that level of empathy and compassion of, does this person even understand us? Or you can never go through the McDonald's drive-through because they can't understand your mom's accent, and so it's really stressful because you're missing out on a lot of cool things. But there are all these small experiences you have that really impact the way that you show up in society and how you see other folks. Okay? Went to an all-women's college, went to Smith, where they say that's where feminism was birthed, where Betty Friedan went, Gloria Steinem. So I do think that my perspective around gender gender roles, gender identity is a lot more progressive than lots of folks. And I'm a Tar Heel, so I went there for law school. Sorry, Husky folks. I came all the way here to Seattle from Atlanta because the Gates Foundation hired me, where I led a compliance team there. And the reason why this work is so impactful to me is that I have two little brown boys who I raise, Wes and Ben, and they're ages 9 and 10. And Wes, who's here in the green shirt, he is only 10 years old, but he is way taller than me. So when you think about where our nation is, and you think about black men in society, and you think about the kind of fear I probably have every day when he's here and how he's been engaged with in different ways, and this is a 10-year-old child, it is constantly in my mind. Okay. And I'm a certified coach, so I do coach people, lots of people who are part of dominant culture, in order to elevate their self-awareness and EQ when it comes to things like diversity and inclusion. A lot of folks want to have an organization that is more diverse, more inclusive, but they don't know what that really means. And kudos to them for not wanting to jump out and say, hey, we're going to be so diverse and inclusive, but not doing the work themselves. And at the same time, I also coach people who are underrepresented in their workplace, so that they're constantly thinking about what their values are, their voice, their mission, and how they show up. When you think about things like imposter syndrome, that's real, and people aren't able to really bring their best and fullest self to work. Okay, and that's my consulting firm, which is Rare Coaching and Consulting. Okay, so here are some facts. We're just going to go through them quickly. There's tons of resources out there for you to vet and validate and think about what do you want to know about diversity and inclusion and why it's so important. I'm just so pleased that now there are so many white papers that are now presented about the impact of diversity and inclusion, how it impacts the bottom line, how it impacts innovation. This is a perfect space to be talking about this in, because diversity and inclusion is such a critical formula or ingredient to getting to innovation. Okay. So this part here, 57% of employees think their companies should be more diverse. African Americans are 16% less likely to be invited to job interviews. I think most of you have probably heard about the resume tests, et cetera, based on the names, exact same credentials, if not better, but yet still not getting through the screening process. Blind applications led to 5 times more female hires. Okay. Racially diverse teams outperform other teams by 35%. 67% of job seekers stated that a diverse workforce was important when considering an employer. Gender and race diversity proven to result in greater innovation and more accurate results. Can you imagine why having different people at a table could get you to greater accuracy? So that inertia and that very thing that makes you potentially uncomfortable for being around people who are different from you is actually the rigor and inertia that you need in order to actually engage in, consider, and think about a lot of different answers and possibilities. If everyone has groupthink and the same perspective in life, you can imagine you're going down the same highway of solution, right? Whereas if you have a lot of people who are talking about things differently, have a different perspective, have a different experience in life, you can imagine that the conversations, there might be way more rigor in what we often call the grown zone, but imagine how much more potent and thoroughly vetted that solution will be because you've had that deeper degree of rigor. So you can understand like the discomfort, right? And kind of how things can get really heated, but then your solution or your outcome might be much more robust. Does that make sense? And that's what we're talking about when we're saying getting to innovation. Okay? This factor, without diverse leadership, women are 20% less likely than straight white men to win endorsement for their ideas. People of color are 24% less likely, and members of the LGBT community are 21% less likely. So do you think the ideas that are coming from these populations are less potent, are not as great? So can you imagine what's happening as this filtering process is happening? What's happening in terms of what's going on in your community or that project that you're working on? Is the outcome really as good as it could be? Okay. All right, so the impact. The companies are losing market opportunities, right? These people who are from different communities and have different life experiences, they're the ones who are most likely able to connect to that market and understand what the need is, the passion is, and even be able to talk about a product or an idea in a different way that resonates with those communities, right? And I always say, does this make sense? I just say that facetiously. I think everything I'm saying makes perfect sense. So. 4 out of 10 working age adults with disabilities are unemployed. Can you imagine the amount of talent we are not leveraging in this society? 22% of our population has a disability. Okay. So who do you think, when we talk about universal design, who do you think is the person who's most qualified, or communities that are most qualified to actually inform universal design? Are there people who are all able-bodied or from dominant culture? When we talk about universal design, we're talking about everyone, right? Not the usual suspect. And so one of these is the ADA. Are you guys familiar with the ADA, Americans with Disability Act? It was one of the last civil rights pieces of legislation that was passed. Do you know who was most impacted by that and who benefited? Able-bodied people, more than people with disabilities. So when you think about walking on sidewalks and you think about that little curve, and I've had 2 kids and those curves were lifesavers, or when you have a toddler in the stroller, you're going down the curve, or were there elevators where there weren't elevators before? Everyone, I think the number is almost 90-something%. 90-something% of all Americans will experience being disabled at some point in their life. So when you think about when you had that broken leg or that arm that wouldn't work and you just thought, oh, awesome that I could just push the button and it opens for me. So you're a beneficiary of ADA. And what about the passing of affirmative action legislation? Who do you think was most benefited by that? So if we just thought directly of a category of people, it would be white women, okay? But if you think about ideals and you think about quality of life, I would arguably say everyone who was in dominant culture. So when you think about how you're hiring, how you're designing, how you're thinking about processes and operations, I would just challenge you to think about communities or individuals who you never think about or who might be the most marginalized. And I practically guarantee you that you're going to come up with ideas that are way more innovative than where you started. Is everybody following me? Okay. I was telling somebody I'm a litigation attorney by trade, so I'm used to walking around and like trying to read people's faces. Another reason here about diversity inclusion is a shift in demographics that are happening. So right now, almost 50% of the global population is female. But if we thought about hiring practices, remember that one where you had to go to blind resumes in order to get 5 times more women hired? Okay, so if we splice that data, these are all women, and you start thinking about women of color and how that number drops. Black women, Asian women, that number drops in terms of access. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I introduce that because there's this concept of when you're talking about intersectionality. And sometimes in a lot of discourse, they talk about men as a whole, as if every man is just so privileged, without thinking about there are different splices and narratives in that. But we like to talk about people all the same instead of starting to actually break down different elements so that we can understand challenges and barriers. Okay. So 51% of children under the age of 5 is 2 or more races. So if you really want to access the talent pool, can you see the value of getting your organization more on board with diversity, equity, and inclusion? You're missing out on a huge part of the talent pool. Those women who would have never been hired because it wasn't a blind resume are the people of color who have never been hired because you looked at a name instead of making your environment much more inclusive and shifting the way that you hire. Are the people who you do hire and they leave because they were unable to really fully contribute because the atmosphere that you had was not inclusive. And around every corner, they got the idea that they did not belong here. Okay? So what's the impact when we don't lean in with diversity, equity, inclusion? I think one thing that I was trying to be clear about is that you're not getting the best talent, right? So here are some of the other issues that come up, which you will probably be familiar with, especially if you're like a social media like follower and obsessed like I can be. Okay. You guys remember this? So Gucci and their awesome blackface sweater. Prada, another blackface issue. H&M, do you guys remember this one? The little boy, the black boy has a hoodie. It says coolest monkey in the jungle, whereas the white Caucasian boy has the survival expert on his. Do you remember this one? The Dove ad. You start dirty and then you get clean. But not only does your shirt get clean, but you change your race and you're super clean. This one with the noose around the neck for Burberry. What do you think that kind of did in terms of their brand? What do you think that did in terms of any employees who were in any of these categories or who was at all marginalized, not even a person of color? Do you think that they showed up at work every day feeling like, yeah, I work for Burberry? Yep. Did you guys see this one? Self-driving cars are likely to hit people who have darker skin complexion. How likely do you think that these faux pas would have happened if the teams, marketing teams, the design teams, had people who fell into these marginalized categories? How much more awesome and improved do you think self-driving cars would have been if they had people of color on that team? And hopefully they had somebody who had different abilities, right? Can you imagine how much more robust that product would be? And they wouldn't be dealing with headlines like this. So raise your hand if you see the value add so far. Okay. I saw some people have their hands up, so I'm going to try to keep going deeper. So innovation, the burkini. So this was more of a faith-based design. But who else do you think probably benefits from a burkini? What's that?
People who sunburn.
Yeah, sunburn or skin cancer, cancer survivors. You can think of a lot of people who would really benefit from that. It's not just one category, right? Innovation fits everyone, even if it was for a targeted group. More people are going to benefit from that. So I thought this was so awesome. Pants that were made for people who have catheters, and they can actually sit, and so the catheter can lay in their pants versus if you've ever seen somebody who has a wheelchair or something, it's like exposed out here. And how much of your human dignity is on the line when you're in a situation like that? But can you imagine who else that would probably benefit? Having something like that where you can sit. You think about people who have to do insulin injections, they have to do all these other things that are out in the open, but to be able to sit, especially if you're in a wheelchair, et cetera, not having all your business out there, feeling like people are focused on you instead of whatever the challenge is that you have to deal with. Okay. Lip Bar, do you guys remember her? She was on Shark Bar and they kind of like dogged her out. So she was making lipsticks and things that work with different color complexions and all organic as well, because different people of different faith don't want those toxins or things that have a pork base in it. And now she's like actually doing really amazing. But that idea of these creations that were made out of innovation, but also a different mindset, different life experience, and being much more inclusive. So I'm hoping that you all are following the narrative around these benefits and how amazing we could be and how much more powerful we could be in terms of thinking about things differently. Okay. So diversity, equity, inclusion, let's unpack those words. So D&I have on here as a philosophy. It's a great tool for impact and innovation, but what does it mean? So I just want you guys to yell out a few things when you think about diversity. What do you think of? Differences, yes, such as? Age, experience, race, socioeconomic, yes, class, Gender, yep. Language, yes. History. Did someone say history? Yes. But a lot of different things. So can you imagine when you go into a company and you say, we're going to be way more diverse? Everyone is going to have a totally different concept, and it's so important to align on what you're talking about. Some people say diversity is just diversity of thought, like, or political parties, or different things, and it doesn't have to necessarily do with identity. It's really important to think about what do you mean when you're saying diversity. I never define it here because it does mean a lot of different things, but I will tell you how I think about it later. But it's important for you to be aligned on how you talk about it and what the philosophy is around it, instead of assuming everyone's talking about the same thing when you say diversity. It's been so diluted now that it almost has no meaning in terms of an imperative for people to act or behave in a different way. Okay. So the big D, this is how I think about it, and part of this is my law training. When I think about diversity and I say the big D, I'm thinking about protected classes. So I feel like it's particularly in the US, but a lot of countries have this as well. There's a handshake just even in our legal documents about recognizing there are some protected classes who have had historic and systemic barriers against their ability to actually fully participate equitably in society. So when you think about the ADA, think about the different titles we have as well. When you think about race, ethnicity, or nationality protected, gender, et cetera, we have this social contract where we agree and we recognize that. And my position is that you cannot possibly be talking about diversity, especially hand in hand with diversity and equity, if you are not always acknowledging the big D. Okay? We would not even have really a lot of conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, but for the history around different groups. Okay, and then there's the little d. And those are things like, hey, you're an introvert and I'm an extrovert. Hey, we have different political views. Or I was born in this part of the country, you're born in that part of the country. All different things that actually feed into diversity as well, still relevant, but I don't believe you can say that you're fully talking about diversity unless you're also including this group. So now when you go to conferences and different things, you will see people talking about diversity, but it never being defined. And you walk away and you realize, or you hear people say, hey, this is a really diverse panel because I am, Stanford class of 70. He's Stanford class of 80. And he's Stanford class of 90. And this was awesome. Look how diverse it was. So you can be really clear with what you're talking about. And if you're in a room and you just hear people say, hey, we need diversity or diverse hire, you have permission to ask, what exactly do you mean when you're saying diverse? And then you can figure out and go from there. Otherwise, you're all just kind of swimming around and you have no idea really what this means. Have you all been in a situation where people are saying, oh, we need diversity, diversity, and you have no idea what they're talking about? Yeah, you have assumptions, but you're like, what does that mean? So equality can get tricky for people to understand. So people say diversity, equity, and inclusion. So equality and equity are different. So equality is more about sameness. So when you think about the women's rights movement and you think, hey, we're going to treat everybody the same. Everybody gets the same thing. It's kind of like the military, right? Everyone is treated exactly the same. But does sameness, and it has this presumption, kind of like meritocracy, that everyone starts from the exact same place, right? So that means that somebody who has this disability, because you're all on the exact same highway with no low barriers for somebody to go on in their wheelchair or their disability, we're still equal because everyone's got the exact same thing. That's what equality is. So do you see what's like missing in that equation? Hey, everyone gets a chance. We're all looking at everybody on the same criteria in terms of being promoted and hired. The same thing, even though somebody may not have ever had access. Everybody has the same ability to be able to get into this college as long as they all have the same SAT, even though you're like in this rural area that didn't have computers or anything, or access or a public library or whatever. We are treating you equally because everyone is getting the same thing and has to meet the same bar. So that's what equality is. But when you hear people talking about DEI or IDE, or however they put the acronyms. You're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is different. So equity is about fairness. It's about giving people access to the same opportunities. It's about recognizing differences from the basis of history when we talk about systemic barriers. And then so that you can actually get to ensuring equality by recognizing what the hurdles are, doing your best to mitigate the hurdles, and then taking them into account as you're doing other things like hiring, etc. One of the things I ask people, especially as they're building businesses or hiring, is don't think about culture fit, think about value add. This person might not have been at Stanford or wherever, or they may have been at a place where maybe the grammar or whatever is not exactly the same, or maybe their SAT scores didn't look like A, B, or C. But then when you start having this conversation, you recognize, wow, they understand this whole experience of this part of society that we need to understand. And what is that going to do for the value base of your company or your organization? Or promoting that rigor so that people's conversations are a little bit different with each other. You cannot pay for that. That is invaluable. To make sure that people, as they're engaging with each other, they're having different types of conversations just in passing. You cannot pay enough money for that type of experience. So here, this is one of the actual images they use to make it a little bit more concrete. So equality, everybody gets the same box, right? Equity, you're looking at where people are and you're adjusting accordingly. So one thing that you get a lot, especially in this world when you bring up the idea of diversity, hey, what are we going to do to add more diversity? Well, I don't know, but what we're not going to do is lower the bar. We're not going to lower our quality, I tell you that. How many of you have heard that? We still want the most qualified person, and that statement only comes up when you hear people say, we want more diversity. All of a sudden, there's this assumption that the quality is going to go down versus thinking, all the things we just went through with innovation, all those things were created by people of color, people with disabilities. I can go on and on. I didn't even include the whole expanse of things. But someone wants to say, we still need to get quality. So there's this terrible assumption that all of a sudden when you inject diversity, that the quality is going down or you're hiring somebody who's less qualified. If you read any of the New York Times, New Yorker, other articles, you always hear this one quality that really puts people above everyone else, which is grit. So when you think about grit and you think about people being resourceful, you think about somebody being really used to being the only one who looks like them in classes and PhD classes and law school or whatever, do you know how much grit that takes? Or knowing that your journey to school and having to get accommodations and raise your hand when something's not working right for you, the hallway's not wide enough, or you can't, the bathroom usage is so much harder. Do you know how much grit that takes? You cannot pay for that kind of grit. But then we want to just look at, what was their score on that test? What school did they go through? Versus what did it take for that person to get there and to finish? That's the person I want on my team. Okay. So inclusion can be kind of hard for people to get. But it's a degree to which diverse individuals are able to participate fully in the power in an organization to share in it, to make decisions as well. And truly, an inclusive group is necessarily diverse, but a diverse group is not necessarily inclusive. Does that make sense to you guys? And I want to go back to one thought about diversity, though. So a lot of people assume and think, hey, we're super diverse because we have that one person, or we have those two people. I want to introduce to you that that's tokenism. That is not diversity. Do you think that one person in that whole leadership of 20 is going to be able to present their ideas or have a voice of dissent in there, or lean in as well and comfortably as everyone else? You're not going to get to innovation, even if you have diversity, a lot of different people but you're not being inclusive, okay? You need that extra ingredient of inclusion in order to get you to the magic of innovation. So people need to be able to speak their voice of dissent. They need to, when we talked about those conversations of rigor when you're brainstorming, they need to be able to lean in too without thinking there's a risk of punitive treatment, or I'm going to be isolated, or I'm going to be punished. And usually people who are parts of out-groups suffer that most. So you see how that ingredient of inclusion is so different? It's kind of like the thing that activates the diversity and gets you to innovation. Okay. All right, so I do this exercise because I know that those are a lot of words that can feel really theoretical. So I try to break it down to make it a little bit simpler. Okay, so it's when everyone is invited to the party, and you might have some different people who are there, faith-based, race, what have you. Everyone's able to come in terms of their calendar being open, etc. And you get some people from different walks of life who do show up. Inclusion is a part when you directly invite all these people, so you're not just waiting on word of mouth, right? Because you could just get a lot of the same people who you deal with. So now you're specifically inviting all of these people, especially those who you don't usually see, because you're like, darn, I have this party every time and everybody knows they're invited, but it's still always like my same crew and everybody who looks the same. But you're going to give them an invitation, right? Say, I want you to be here. So you're going to proactively invite folks. So equity is when you not only explicitly invite the outsiders to the party, but they have some kind of power over the type of party, right? Like normally you're going to have the same type of music, the same type of food, and the same crew. But you want people to come and feel invited and included. So there might be people who don't eat pork, so you want to make sure that your menu addresses that. There are going to be people who love this kind of music, and you want to make sure that at least when they come, they feel like they're connected. You may not change the whole playlist. And you're going to make sure that you have all these other opportunities, right? You might ask them about other things that they might want to enjoy, right? You're not just saying, we're going to be equal, everybody could come, I invited everybody, and they just didn't come. You're actually going to practice the principle of inclusion and equity. Are you guys following me? Okay. So, some people believe that when you're exercising diversity, equity, inclusion as a philosophy, that all of a sudden, the fun and the party has just gotten narrower. And now they're getting more priority than I am. They're taking away from my party. They're changing the whole thing. It's not what it used to be. They must not want me there. They're just doing everything for that group now. Have you ever heard that? Kind of like, oh, now they're trying to do these diverse hires and they're going to take X's seat when they should have been the one who got hired. Like this idea, the scarcity mindset of there being less for everybody, or the quality's going down. It's like such a Debbie Downer, right? I want to go back to the slides with the burkinis and everything, right? So, I have to challenge people to think about it a lot differently. So, imagine the same party, everyone gets an invitation. You get an invitation, you get an invitation, everybody's getting an invitation, right? Love Oprah. People are confused, like, why is it that my party always looks the same? It's always the same people are here. What is going on? So to get to this part, that means you have to have a level of awareness of who's not at the table, okay? So you have to work on yourself to figure out what's going on where there's an omission or people who aren't there. You need to have a degree of awareness to even get to the point of being inclusive, right? Really diversity as well. So you say, you know what? The folks who are never coming here, I really want them to be here. So now you're going to specifically be like coming up and giving them that invitation, putting it in their hand. Hey, I really want you to come. What is it that you really like? Hey, what kind of music do you like? What do you blah, blah. You're like being focused and targeted, and these people are true invites. See how that's really different from, well, we had the invitation, everybody was invited, versus I recognize people aren't here. I want those people to be included. There's a premise of thinking it's going to be better and more fun, like this positive premise versus, and I want to, something might go down, people are going to think differently of me. So you have to kind of start with this different intention and mindset. Okay? And were people, is the party less fun? It's a bigger, bolder party. People go away finding out new musicians, having conversations with people they never knew of, maybe going to a different concert, doing things differently. That party was like, now there was the shakeup, right? Totally different. Even the people who were going all the time was like, it's kind of the same thing. We know exactly what's going to happen there. But now you're kind of breathing new life into it. Okay. So in order to exercise diversity, equity, inclusion, you got to be aware of the current state. What's going on now? Who's around you, who's not around you? You got to recognize things about people's history. We're always talking about why is it that some people are never a part of clinical trials. Now, if you know history, you know exactly why some people are not a part of clinical trials. Okay? Why do some women never go to certain conferences, male-dominated conferences about transportation operations? You got to understand the history of their experience there. Okay? Why are some people never on that floor? We don't know why we can never. Well, because the elevator is usually broken, and it's really difficult to get there if you have to actually use some type of accessibility support. It's really hard to get there. I'd rather just not even take that class. So you got to understand what's going on historically and what's going on with different people in order for you to exercise diversity, equity, inclusion well. You know, we have this exercise where we're going to put those police shields up that are the ones that encourage people, if you're a part of the LGBT plus community, like this is a safe space and it's a police shield. But then recognizing what police engagement historically has really been for people in the LGBT community. So actually seeing that wasn't providing comfort for a lot of people, the very community who was supposed to feel safe and supported. But who would have known unless you understood the community and the history? You see how important history is? Okay. So this one, how many of you have heard the stat that it's women get paid 70, I think it's now 76% on the dollar of men? Have you heard that stat? Yeah, I heard it a lot too. But you know what? The stat was wrong. White women get paid 76 on the dollar, cents on the dollar than white men. Black and Hispanic men get paid less than white women. Black and I should be saying Latinx people, women are getting paid, they're the lowest paid of all. So when we are actually replicating that, that fact, we have erased everybody else from the conversation. Nobody else exists. And the only way that you could actually talk back to this data is if you had enough awareness to think, well, who was a part of that? Wait, let me look at the number. What about these communities? How many times have you heard this stat said over and over again? MSNBC, Fox, CNN, everybody's saying this. But unless you have an eye to awareness of who's not in that conversation, you're going to be saying this too. It'll have you as a black or brown man or woman repeating that stat too. It doesn't even include you. So do you see how this can also impact research and data? So if you didn't know the breakdown about that statistic, are you likely to be looking for ways to solve it for these other communities? They don't even exist, right? So when we're talking about pay equity, you're only thinking about one group. You're not even doing anything to address the other communities because you're like stuck on this. Everybody's saying over and over again. So you see how you have to have a degree of awareness and asking certain questions that are beyond maybe your own identity so that you can be inclusive, so that you can be equitable, so that we can get to equality. Okay. So what do? It takes a lot in terms of trust and self-awareness, having conversations with different people. I think the answer is super, super simple. But you do have to admit to yourself where are your own limits. We're always learning all the time. I'm learning something new every time I'm doing different sessions, things I never even thought of. So the idea of that growth mindset, being trustful, being vulnerable, doing the work. I think most of you, especially being in these kind of spaces, innovative spaces, you kind of have a little gene there already for continuous improvement and continuous learning. You got to put it into this space too in terms of understanding people and people's experiences. Okay? That degree of self-awareness, heightened EQ that you have. Okay? And then how do you make sure this is just a part of your practice every day? There's one thing that you can do that actually encompasses all of this. It will make sure that you're always in this growth mindset, that you're challenging yourself, that you're growing, that you're learning more about people you never knew about. And that's switching up your community. So if you have a community where 85% of the people look like you, class, orientation, race, gender, you are not going to get to that point. That means going in spaces that you may feel, there's nobody here that looks like me. People have been doing it every day. I do it every day. Only one in the room. You can do it too. So the idea of making connections and relationships and being in different spaces all the time. There's other things you can do. You can read a book all day. You can read blogs all day, podcasts all day. But putting it in practice, making yourself comfortable around people who are really different from you, who eat different food, who have different political perspectives, that is how you do it in a continuous way. That's also how your empathy for other people grows. And I didn't put this stat in here, and I should have, is that there's a tracking of where we're going as a society in terms of where we're breaking down barriers and becoming much more inclusive. So when you think about our LGBT plus population, that's the one that has shifted cultural mindset the greatest in the shortest amount of time. And I don't think it's because all of a sudden people think, oh, this attribute is better than this attribute. It's because people had family members who were part of the LGBT plus community. They had friends, but when you have a daughter or son or an uncle, that's really different. These are people you're eating with every day who you raised. So that relationship and that amount of empathy and compassion that you experience is totally different than saying I have a black or brown neighbor. So it's really that relationship. So you juggle up and shuffle up that community that you're engaging with every day. Who's at your dinner table, who's not? Who's invited to your celebrations, who's not? Who's brought to your birthday party, your engagement parties, or just your bowling event, and who's not? Who are you giving a deliberate and intentional invitation to? Are you looking at your menu and your playlist? Is it harder for some people to get to that venue than other people? Switching up your community is going to get you through all of these different barriers of being able to understand other people, be comfortable, and invite and do it almost like a natural next step. Really easy solution. We all are very tribal people. We all want to be part of a group. But how many of us intentionally invite other people who are so different from us to be a part of that group and create an environment for them to be connected in it? All right. And then there's like a lot of resources. I have way more than this. If you ever want them, you can just email them to me. But I always invite people to take the Harvard Implicit Bias Assessment Test. It's been taken by hundreds of thousands of people. But it's great just in terms of gauging where am I at about different things. They have it for everything from skin complexion to gender to other things to test your attitudes about it. Harvard podcast on women working is awesome, amazing for people to listen to. When we talk about history, Ibram Kendi does really great work in breaking down history, stamped from the beginning. Brene Brown, If You Lead Teams, and also her book, I Thought It Was Me. She does a great job of really breaking down what exactly is empathy versus shame-based behaviors. And that's just great EQ work to have, especially if you lead or building teams, it's very important, or how you can show up more vulnerably as well. So just a few tools there for you. I have a ton more, but I just want to think about what would I tell people just in a moment about resources that they could use. Okay, so now I want to open up for questions. I want to leave 20 minutes. We only have about 15, but I do want to have time for questions. Thank you. Any questions? Here we go. This sir here.
I'm a physical therapist. I'm working on inclusiveness and equity related to disabled individuals, as well as individuals who are LGBTQ plus A as well. And the problem seems to be when it's not about just having diverse people in the room, it's when you need to make accommodations and have equitable solutions to problems and considering your processes and environment the same. So how do I go about bridging those conversations with leadership?
So a lot of times when I'm thinking about this work or sharing it with people, I think about it as head and heart work, and I introduce it to people like that. So you can be as empathetic and as you want to be, but if the head part in terms of thinking about operations, processes and procedures, et cetera, if that's not there, you're not going to get there, right? In terms of, I think processes and procedures too are really important as a check and balance. So when and you think about it a lot in hiring. So some organizations now have that you have blind resumes. So you can teach people all day in terms of, hey, you're excluding these people, you're showing these biases, but you have to kind of safeguard the process too to protect us from our own built-in biases, or even in terms of backsliding. So there is a thing of saying you have to do both together. And I try as much as possible not to divorce issues of diversity, equity, inclusion from general issues, because I think it should be so much a part of the DNA. So when we provide, one example of that is when we provide things, different types of workshops in our organization, we have them categorized under leadership training, because this is a core competency in terms of being a leader. And also when somebody sees something that says it's D&I, it all of a sudden gets marginalized versus thinking, no, you have to have cultural competence. You need to know how to have conversations with different people. And I do think that there's this arm of thinking about issues in a much more expansive way. So the battle to have the ADA passed, I think that it may have even been easier to pass if people thought about the impact on everyone. Because if you had thrown in there, hey, look at how this helps women who are pregnant, or when you had that broken leg, or when, so even the solutions and how we talk about things, if they're more expansive, because I truly do believe that it's for a greater good of everyone capitalizes, but I think you roll that into it as well, and not making it seem so much like it's just this group. And also outcome-based metrics. So I think that head and heart, or also quantitative and qualitative marriage and data and conversations is important. Did that answer your question? Okay, we can talk more later too.
Hi, thanks. It's a great presentation. A quick question on the implicit, I think you're talking about the implicit associations test, that, the first one. And I know there were some articles that came out over the last year that cited several meta-analyses over the last 10 years that kind of showed that maybe that is a great instrument for starting discussions, but that in terms of actual like test-retest reliability and validity in terms of predicting actual behaviors, that the IAT didn't really work. And so I wonder if you're aware of anything, besides being able to say, well, it's good for starting conversations, are you aware of any other kind of assessment that has been, has better validity or reliability for measuring implicit bias?
Yes, so I will say that also implicit bias versus actual discriminatory behavior or what you're doing is different. And just because you might be gauged a certain way to have a proclivity towards a certain way doesn't mean you're going to act on it. So I do want to be clear about that. And I think that every instrument that comes up, especially if you're science-oriented, you realize that there's so many variances and variables that there's always a question about data, right? But to me, even beyond the measurement, the tool is exactly like you said. It's a starter in conversation. I think the shift in change and behavior really happens with who you're surrounded by and your community. And I think it's something that feels so soft to people that they're like, but I really have seen that it's a relationship and it's the connection. In terms of another type of assessment, though, that can help in that starter dialogue is one that's more general when you think about EQ assessments. And I think looking at numbers and ratings around compassion, empathy, self-empathy, there's a great one that's learning in action that I sometimes use with clients. I like that one because it gauges how you show up in relationship with people. Like, so there are actually videos and different things that you're responding to. But it also breaks down what are the different emotions that are happening, and it allows you to address that and do your self-work versus it being so much about how you're engaging with other people. Because a lot of this, I think, is mainly about your self-work. How open are you going to be to other people? How much shame are you experiencing that you're unable to get to a certain point with other people? How much guilt or anger do you have? How much anger do you not even have or express because culturally it's wrong for you to express anger? Like, all of these things tie in together, I think. Yeah. Mike. And I want to give a shout out to Mike because he's actually the one who recommended me as a speaker some time ago. So.
Thanks very much for coming. This is so useful. So I do a lot of recruiting, and I always find myself going down the path of like looking for the same qualifications.
And I'm always, asking myself, who am I missing out on? Because it seems like my criteria is always just, I try to broaden my criteria, and then it just, as I have a hard time finding people that meet it, it just like keeps narrowing. And I end up finding all the same people I would have found. It's like I keep going around and around and around. Like, what could I do differently to open up my criteria to find people that I probably wouldn't have found if I keep sticking on this path?
I think it does go to that idea of value add. And so some people, one thing that I assess a lot with people is how teachable and how coachable are they? So rather than them coming pre-baked and already having all these skills, some people learn so quickly and they're super resourceful. And I think about that, and there are different ways in the interview process where you can look at how people approach problems and challenge. Like, just because somebody comes and they may have a lot of the technical expertise and experience, maybe when you're taking them to that next level, they're going to be more resistant. Maybe it's going to take them longer to get to another place because of they're not exposed in that same way of having to be pressured for resourcefulness or resilience. Or maybe when you get them into a team dynamic, they're not going to be somebody who is able to foster an environment that is going to be more inclusive of other people. So there are a lot of other skills that you're going to look at in order to think about their success rate or what they're bringing to your company. Because if you have somebody who, wow, they're so super smart, there's this whiz kid, what have you, but they come on the team and they're just like a jerk, or either they're a quick learner, but it's like on my time and how I want to do it. Like, there's a lot of other things that you gauge when you think about building your team, right? And you're not going to get that off the resume necessarily, right? Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you for the talk. I'm just wondering, do you have any like practical examples, maybe companies in Seattle that have really taken it on, internalized it, and have shown benefits, or has shown struggles too? I don't know. Any?
I don't. I think there's a lot of great organizations that are having conversations about it. I haven't seen anybody who's doing something really innovative and different and really pushing the needle. But lots of conversations, which I think is great in terms of a starting point. And I'm sorry I can't give you a model.
How do you think Gates does?
So I was at Gates Foundation for about 8 years. I think that it's very difficult when you're in an organization that is, so it's a foundation and it's a family-run foundation. And there's 2 family members who run it, right? So I think just like other places, it's exuding their values and what they're exposed to or not and what their priorities are. So I think that it's probably not the most ideal model because it's not necessarily like a democracy, right? And I think that's fair because that's their family, fortune, and worth and values there. So you have to look at where people are coming and what's the priority there. Does that make sense? Yeah. I think, Gates Foundation is very much a Seattle company that's doing global work. And Seattle itself has a lot of homogeneity and other things that are happening here that haven't been addressed.
One more quick one. Yeah, we are doing a startup, Vranium, that's focused on building soft skills, inclusive leadership, that sort of thing,
Great.
using virtual reality and some AI technology.
Great.
I wondered just what your thoughts are on the role of training and how far you think training can go. Obviously, it can only be a part of a solution, but
Yeah.
have you seen anyone get results with any kind of training efforts or education efforts?
Yeah, good question. I think that I'm a big fan of training that's in person, in cohort groups. I don't think e-learning in this space does a lot. I have a commitment in my organization that 80% has to always be in person and in connection. No more than 20% can ever be e-learning. I don't even want to get to 20%. And then when you look at studies about change in behavior and culture, the main reason is not because of the policies and all the head work and the quantitative analyses, it's because of relationships. And so a lot of it is about social accountability. So you can imagine being in this room talking about unconscious bias with 15 or 20 people, and they're always interactive and sharing connection and stories. When you go out of that room, if you want to act all crazy, somebody in that room is going to be looking at you. And that type of accountability is really huge for us as human creatures. That social accountability, everybody wants to be liked. Everybody wants to be a part of a tribe. That may not feel like that's the coolest motivation, but you have to look at how people are wired and what the instinct is going to be. And a lot of times if it's that simple, there's no reason we should not adhere to that. And those conversations you have about topics that a lot of people consider to be hard, you know, you're looking over, if the COO is over there, their assistant or support staff is in the room, you're hearing their story, you walk out of there, you start acting crazy, she's looking at you or he's looking at you like, remember when, I remember when you said, like that type of social accountability goes a long way. So I do think that workshops and training have to be formatted and done in a certain way. I think there have to be safe spaces. I think there shouldn't be a lot of shame. I think there just has to be the engagement with people as people. That sounds so kooky and just, ugh. But I do think that that's how people shift behavior.
Hey there. Thanks
Hey.
for the time. Have you seen any measures in the interviewing process to protect against bias that you think are actually effective and are the right way to do it to try to keep room for bias out as much as possible?
Yeah, so I think that when you saw some of those measurements, there are a lot of studies around that, everything from the blind resumes to blind interviewing. People always cite the cello audition where there's the curtain there and more women were hired to principal positions. So I think there are a lot of things where there's been studies, but I do think part of what should be included where companies are behind is accountability. So when I think about if you're going to be on a search committee or a hiring manager, there should be some type of steps you're taking to prepare yourself and ready yourself to be in a room with somebody who might not look like you, and thinking about what can my biases be that might come up. So I think that there is that part of being made ready and someone facilitating that for you, not like you're just reading this guidance document, but you being interviewed in terms of, okay, well, what are you going to do when such and such? You know, I've had definitely understandings or recognized when and heard narratives of somebody being in an interview and they're grilled about the fact of what is an HBCU. And well, can white people go to a HBCU? So you went to a school where white people weren't allowed to go. Instead of understanding the history around HBCUs, first of all, it's inappropriate. But this woman had to give her an American history, lesson in there as an interviewee that was actually when schools were segregated and we weren't allowed to actually go to dominant schools. So that's how they came about, but they're open. So you can imagine it throws everything off. But I think that anybody who is responsible in leadership or hiring, they have to be accountable to do their own work as well before they're in there. It's kind of like you wouldn't let somebody just loose on your employees when they haven't done their work to be a good leader. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
My question is, in a diverse environment, maybe there's one or two individual in a diverse environment, consider it. How do you help those two individuals make inroad into inclusion? An environment, say two people is different in this group, you consider diverse, but these two people have to kind of make inroad and say, okay, you have a diverse group, two people. How do you expand that? How do you make inroad to become more inclusion? Just because you, like you said, you're a diverse group, that doesn't mean you are inclusive. How do those two individuals, or that small group or a few diverse group of individuals make inroads?
Okay, and are those two people a part of a large, like what percentage of the group are they?
5%.
Okay.
5% or less.
So my answer would be it's not their responsibility, and it's the leadership's responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the two people who are the least represented to make that environment inclusive. That's the work that the leadership should be doing, and those two people cannot do it. And so there's this thing that I usually I used to just kind of more colloquially call it the black tax, but it's really like the marginalized people tax. That when you're some of the only ones, you're like the voice for everybody in that group. And then you're usually the ones who are leading the employee resource groups. You're usually the one who's facilitating all the learning panels on top of your other job. And guess what? It's exhausting and tiring, and it's taking away from your opportunity to excel here with what you're hired for, because you're doing all this other work, and it's a lot of heavy emotional labor, and ain't nobody else doing it. And sometimes no one's even coming, and how much more demoralizing is that? So it is the responsibility of the organization and the leadership to make that a value and a priority. It is not the job of the two people who happen to be the people of color or the LGBT plus people or just whatever it is. It is not their job or their responsibility.
May I ask the second question?
Unless it's part of what you're getting paid to do. Because I do it all the time.
So how do those people would like to stay there to be able to feel inclusive instead of, hey, I'm going to leave?
Yep.
Well, how do they make the environment, work environment, better for them?
So I have a whole different workshop that I do that's about self-care and resilience and sustainability for people who are in these environments and they may be not part of the dominant culture and they're always having microaggressions or other things happening. I have a completely different workshop, but there are things that you have to do to actually really keep yourself focused on what your values are, why are you there in the first place, what are the outcomes. But there's also some work about exercising that grace with coworkers when they're on their learning journey as well. So, but that's a whole different workshop and it's so specific to people as well, but there is the work that you do for yourself, but it is not about how do I change this whole environment. That's not your job. Okay?
Thank you, Aiko.
All right, thank you.